Okay, so part 4 is about the positive externalities, and here we're talking about the positive externalities of education. So let's say that the marginal cost of educating a university student online is $3,000 a year. All the numbers we're going to look at here are just funny numbers, they're not realistic numbers. You should probably add a 0 to the end of that to get a more realistic number. Anyway, the Excel spreadsheet provided shows the marginal private benefit schedule from a university education. Alright, so here's our table. As you can see there, the marginal social cost per student is $3,000 per student, irrespective of how many students there are. So for the first million students, it's $3,000 per student. For the 5 millionth student, it's still $3,000 per student, and so on. Now, if we look at the marginal private benefit per student column, this is the benefit that will be derived by a student from that, a student alone, no one else. We can see for the first million students, we're assuming here, this is of course ridiculous, silly numbers. So for the first million students, they would be getting $6,000 benefit per student. For the 4 millionth student, it'll be $3,000 per student benefit. For the 6 millionth student, it would be $1,000 benefit for the student. Alright, so far so good. That's the table. So our first question is, what would be the free market uni fee per student? And also, with no government involvement in university education, how many students would enroll? Well, what we're looking for here, we're looking for a free market equilibrium. That is, where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. The marginal private benefit, that is, equals the marginal private cost. Now, the marginal private cost is the same as the marginal social cost in this story. So it's pretty easy to find. That's going to be here. So $3,000 equals $3,000. This, if you were to draw this graphically, this would be the point of intersection between the demand curve, the marginal private benefit curve, which would be downward sloping. We can see it starts at 6,000, then 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, and the marginal cost curve, which would be a horizontal line at 3,000. Okay, so we can see that the point of intersection between those two curves, if you can imagine that, would be at 4 million students. So that would be the number of students who would be educated in this free market story. Now, what that free market story is not taking into account, of course, is the positive externalities associated with education. It's not just the students themselves who gain benefits from an education. There are people who are not actually participating in the education sector. They're not the students. But nonetheless, they are deriving benefits because students get an education. So, for example, there's, by virtue of education, there tends to be a reduction in poverty and the associated cost with that. There's reduced crime and a reduction in the associated costs of crime. There's tends to be improved health outcomes and therefore lower health costs for everyone else as well. They don't have to pay for the same higher health costs. There's labour productivity improvements, which result ultimately in economic growth, that is, increased production of goods and services, which then can benefit other people in the society who don't get that education because of the growth in industries, increases the incomes of people who are in those industries. They spend that money. That increase in spending then generates demand in other sectors of the economy for people who hadn't got that education. Okay, and then of course there's increased education tends to result in a greater engagement with civil and political institutions in the society, according to, within the boundaries of the laws of the society. That is, you get more engaged citizens, basically, with higher education. Alright, so all of those external benefits are not being taken account of in a private market. Right? Those benefits being enjoyed by other members of the society. Now, assuming the marginal benefit, of course this is just funny numbers, assuming the marginal external benefit is 50% of the marginal private benefit, what would be the marginal social benefit of education at each quantity of students? So here we are. What we want to do is we want to calculate the positive externality. So 50% of 6,000 for the first million, and 50% of $5,000 per student for the second million, and 50% of 4,000 for the third million, and blah blah blah, and so on. Ta-da. So these are the positive externalities that are being generated by the production and consumption of education. Hypothetically, of course, because these are at the different possible levels of education, from 1 million students to 6 million students. Alright, so now we want to calculate the marginal social benefit per. So that's going to be pretty simple. It's the marginal private benefit plus the positive externality. Gives you the overall benefit to the society per student of 1 million students being engaged in education. And again, it's the same story for 2 million, the second million student being engaged in education, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty easy to calculate the overall marginal social benefit per student of education at all the different levels of enrollments that we could imagine. Easy. Clearly you can see the marginal social benefit per student is greater than the marginal private benefit per student. There are other members of society who are benefiting from the private consumption of education. Okay, I don't know why we're doing that again. Moving on. What is the socially efficient enrollment number? Well, the socially efficient enrollment number, the allocatively efficient level of enrollment, is going to be where the marginal social benefit of the last student employed just equals the marginal social cost of educating that student. So that's going to be here. The marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit. That is 5 million students. As we can see, the socially efficient, or the allocatively efficient level of education is higher than the free market level of education, which is one of the justifications for government intervening in a private education market and providing subsidies for students to encourage greater enrollment so that we get to the allocatively efficient level of enrollment, the optimal level of enrollment, the optimal amount of education. If the government subsidises universities to the value of the positive externality, as I just mentioned, so that the socially efficient number of students will enrol. Socially efficient here means the allocatively efficient number of students will enrol. What is the amount paid by taxpayers for this? Well, we're going to be enrolling 5 million students. Now there's a positive externality of 1,000. So the subsidy that's going to be paid, right, is going to be equal to the positive externality. So it's a subsidy paid to people who will enrol in education. And as we can see, at the level of 5 million students, that positive externality is 1,000 per student. So the government will be paying a subsidy of $1,000 per student in this hypothetical example to encourage enrolment to increase from the market outcome to the optimal, socially optimal outcome of 5 million. So the subsidy of $1,000 per student multiplied by 5 million students gives you the total amount of subsidy that has to be paid. That's 5 billion students, $5 billion in total. And that money presumably will be paid by taxpayers. As to which taxpayers pay, whether they're high income, middle income, that will depend on the tax system you have. The more progressive the tax system, the more of that $5 billion will be paid by higher income earners. The less progressive, the more of that $5 million will be paid by middle and lower middle income earners. Of course, if you have a wholly tax system, that is a tax system in which companies and private individuals can figure out various ways of avoiding tax by putting most of their income through Cayman Island bank accounts or something like that, as a number of the wealthiest individuals tend to do, then the burden will fall on the middle income earners who don't have access to the Cayman Islands or Jersey Island or other kinds of tax havens. Anyway, so that is that.